Thank you again for presenting the Egyptian situation from the perspective of a tax expert. Now, I'd like to ask Mr. Mario Mansour, who is the coordinator of METAC IMF, and he was the vice president of the tax policies. He has experience of 25 years in more than 40 countries. He used to work in the Canadian government, in the Canadian Ministry of Finance. So we would like to listen to his perspective. He covered more than 13 countries in the region, give us an overview of the policies that might be custom tailored to Egypt. The floor is yours, Mr. Mario. And I'm sorry if I always ask the speakers to be short and brief. Because we are lagging behind in time because we need to finish at 4 p.m. So sorry for always asking people to hurry up.
So 10, 15 minutes?
10, 15 minutes,
Okay.
please. Thank you, Mario.
Okay, Masa al khair. I'll have to speak in English, but you can ask questions in Arabic.
Absolutely.
And we can speak in Arabic one-on-one, but I'll have a bit of difficulties doing this in Arabic. I would like to thank the center for the invitation, Dr. Abla, and of course, Amir, with whom I've had a very good working relationship in Egypt here when he was Vice Minister of Taxation, and other colleagues in the room who I presume had a good lunch and wanted to have a break. But the lighter room is actually better because we have better chances for having a debate on this issue. Before we started, when we were having lunch, I looked at the pamphlet, and there's a nice pamphlet in actually the package that the ECS gave you, which lists Egypt compared to a number of countries according to various indicators. One of those indicators is happiness. And Egypt ranked 122 out of 156. And I couldn't help myself thinking about how much of that is due to taxes. You'll be the judge. I'll probably not well placed to say anything about this. But anyway, I'm going to try to do something a little bit simpler than what has been discussed this morning. But when Amir sent me the program, I found it a little bit strange that he would choose international taxation and small business taxation. Then I thought a little bit about this, and I decided that I want to convince you that there is a linkage between these two, and that the linkage is actually stronger than one might think. So I'm going to go through a little bit of how can we think about informality? What does it mean to be informal, economically speaking, tax speaking, etc. We need to think about framework before we introduce systems for the taxation of informality, about a framework that is convincing and that is solid. Why? Well, simply because informality is something that we don't observe. If we can actually observe informality, it would be much easier to tax it. But we cannot observe informal activity or informal firms. So when we design policy so that people don't have an incentive to hide into informality. So the important thing here is that we're designing taxes for formality, not for informality. And the second point is why care? Why do we need to tax informality anyway? Can we actually tax it? Is it too small to be relevant for tax purposes? Then I'm going to go through a little bit of theoretical and empirical considerations because there is something in the literature that could help us think about this. And unfortunately, my experience tells me that countries don't use it that much and design systems, left and right under false assumptions and misconceptions, as you rightly mentioned this morning. And then I'll end up with just a few lessons that could help us think about how to go about taxing informality, if I use the word. So the first thing is I thought about a framework to define informality by having, that table is not very clear, but essentially think about size and informality. We know that size is highly correlated with informality. Why? Because large firms are never informal. They're visible. We know what large firms are. I mean, this morning we spent 4 hours talking about essentially profit shifting, which is mainly a large firm phenomenon, multinational phenomenon, but also domestic large and medium-sized firm phenomenon. And large firms hide income. They don't hide themselves. They hide their income. Profit shifting is one example. By the way, profit shifting, what we mean by profit shifting has evolved over the past 100 years. I love Western movies, and there's a movie by Clint Eastwood that's called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I don't know if you've seen that movie. That's a wonderful movie that talks about the tension between the good and the bad, and the ugly being in the middle, not knowing whether he should go to the good or to the bad. Now, international taxation has evolved in such a way that the bad has disappeared. We think of things nowadays, we look at international taxes as being only good or ugly. That middle ground has disappeared. What used to be acceptable profit shifting today is unacceptable, even I'd say illegal income hiding. So the medium firms, what do the medium firms do? They also do some profit shifting, but a lot of it tend to be domestic, and a lot of it tend to be inflicted by governments themselves. So think about businessmen in the room. Think about the opportunities you have as a purely domestic company in Egypt, the opportunities that you have to hide income. There are many, many, many opportunities in what we call domestic profit shifting, meaning taking income from a taxable activity and declare it as a non-taxable activity, legally speaking. Another form of informality in medium companies is undeclared employees. We know in countries where labor taxes on employment are very high, companies tend to hire under the table. I'll hire you by the hour, by the day, or whatever, and then I'm going to pay withholding taxes less or nothing to the government. So again, different shades of what informality mean. These are not informal businesses, they are formal. They just hide income and taxes in different ways. Small firms, when you get to small and micro firms, they have actually more options to hide things, but the value is not as important relative to their total income. So a micro firm, for example, can be completely hidden. A small trader can be completely unknown to government or to the tax authority. That's almost impossible for a large company. So a small trader can hide itself from the regulations in a country. Small trader can hide also income by under-declaring turnover, which is a bit more difficult for a large company. Large companies tend to exaggerate expenses or play with transfer pricing. A medium or small trader would simply not declare sales. So they have more options to hide, but those options in total, when we think about values, they're not as important as the options played by large companies. So in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say here, so as companies become large, the number of strategies they can use to hide income diminish because they play mostly by exaggerating expenses, but they can become more visible. So there's a bit of contradiction. I'm bigger as a company, I'm more visible, but I hide more income. I'm smaller as a company, I'm less visible, but I hide less income. Well, simply because I'm small. I don't have an income generating capacity. So we have to keep these things in mind when we design regimes for taxing small business. So why care? Why care? There are arguments for and arguments against, or I'd like to talk about the validity of these arguments. So the first argument for taxing small business across the board, now I'm not talking about informal and formal, for taxing any small business or micro business, the first argument is equity. And it goes to the heart of everybody has to participate in building government, building society. In terms of value, it doesn't really matter because we know that micro companies don't have value, don't have a big value. But in terms of connection with government, it's important that citizens feel they're part of the game, that they contribute something. The other argument is economic efficiency, which is that there are significant empirical studies that show that when small business tax regimes are actually designed, or regulation in general is not designed well, small business gets trapped in a small business, meaning that my capacities to grow, to be creative, is actually being killed by regulation. So I stay small because financially it is convenient for me, but the cost that I have to pay, that certain things, certain ideas I have, I can't realize them because my tax rate will increase significantly if I do. So that's a distortion. The third argument is revenue, and revenue really, who cares? Because if I'm really thinking about micro and very small, there is no tax money there. There's no revenue for the government. We don't tax small business because we think we're gonna get revenue from them. We tax them for different reasons. And I'll talk a little bit about these reasons. And simplicity. And small business, some people say, well, small businesses need to exist because we need to make taxes simple for a small business. So we can't apply the full tax system on small business. Again, this argument is not really, it depends on really what small business regime you have. Egypt, for example, at some point had 35 or 40, if I remember, different regulations for taxing small business. The regime was one regime, but the administration applied this in such a complex way that you wonder really, are you making things simple for small business? So please don't sleep. This is not complicated. It's actually very simple. I'm going to try to explain a little bit how the incentives of taxation to small business. So forget about the details. Just take the numerator and the denominator. In the numerator, what we have is two things. What we call the marginal value of public funds. What is the marginal value of $1 in taxes? How much government can get out of $1 that is above $1 because it provides a public service that a private dollar cannot provide? So usually it's a lot more than $1. Study shows that it could be as high as $1.50. So 150% return on investment if you're providing a true public service that the private market cannot provide. So that's the little d. So the more the value is important to a country, the more you want to raise taxes, right? Including on small business. The other two parameters are the cost of tax administration and compliance. Obviously, the higher the tax compliance cost and the tax administration cost, the higher the threshold that you want to have for a small business, right? Because if it costs you too much to collect $1 from a small business, you have to raise that threshold, to larger businesses to make it worthwhile. Otherwise, your administration will spend significant resources on small businesses. And the expressions at the bottom, in the denominator, they simply include things like tax rate and margins. So if your margin is very, very high, you want to tax more. You want to have more companies in the net. But if your margin is very, very, very low, you don't care. Which is one of the reasons why some countries distinguish between small business in the service sector versus small business in the non-service sector. So these are theoretical things that actually empirically have quite a bit of support. And so let me give you a little bit, a few points on this. So what happens if the cost of compliance is decreased to 0? Suppose you have no cost of compliance in raising $1 from a small business. What would you want to do? Tax everybody, because there's no cost to doing it, right? A dollar raised from a large company costs the same thing as a dollar raised from a small company. You would want to tax everybody. So those theoretical and empirical considerations give us actually, and including the formula, give us quite a bit of ingredients to think about how we want to tax small business. What happens if the marginal value of public funds is very, 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 very high? You want to tax more, of course, because your return on investment as a government is very high. Take a country that doesn't have any roads, right? When you put a road, what happens? A lot of things could happen, right? People are walking on safe grounds. They're driving on safe grounds. A lot of things could happen. Transportation has transformed economic development over the past 20th century. And transportation was largely a public service. It wasn't actually a private service. So in Egypt, when we say the tax ratio or the tax to GDP ratio is 14%, study shows that below 15%, countries grow less faster than above 15%. We've done research actually at the IMF that shows clearly a country with a higher than 15% tax to GDP ratio grows faster than countries below 15%. So 14%, we're on the edge, and there are other ways of actually estimating this. The needs, your needs for spending on public services, if you cost those needs, you'll probably find that you need more than 14% in GDP. But again, 14%, like, don't put too much faith in it, because in all countries, what government collects in tax revenues is not the indication of the government cost. There are other things, right? There are state-owned enterprises that, charge perhaps prices above market prices, which would be considered in economics as a tax. Because why would you charge, people a price above market price? Because you have the monopoly to do so. So we don't distinguish between these things and taxes. To the consumer, it's all the same. It's money going out from my pocket that I could have spent on something else if I had to pay only the tax, but not something else above the tax. I'm going to skip the others in the interest of time, but look at the right-hand side of this. These are the compliance costs in selected countries, a study done by the IFC, in selected countries in Eastern Europe. It can be as high as 18% of turnover. 18% of turnover. Most taxes around the world on turnover, presumptive tax system on turnover, never exceed 5%. So the compliance cost of paying 5% is more than 3 times that. So what does those empirical considerations tell us about how we should think about small firms? Well, first, one thing that we've learned from the empirical literature is that small business regimes, they're not static. They actually create something that we haven't observed before we establish those small business regimes. And one of the most important result in the empirical literature is what we call bunching. When you create a small business regime, companies bunch just below the threshold defining the small business. So you see a huge number of companies. Let's say your threshold is 100,000 US dollars. A huge number just below. Why? They don't want to declare more. Why? Because if they declare more, they're going to pay more. Why? Because you designed your system in such a way that a small business pays in taxes, not in compliance costs, in taxes, a lot less than a regular business. So they bunch around the threshold. What we recommend in these cases, raise the threshold. If you have a lot of bunching below the threshold that you as an administration don't have the resources to control, just lift the threshold. People would declare more. They would actually move their turnover because there are benefits from being truthful. As a business, you gain from it, but for the tax authority, you lose from it. So raise the threshold. They will move a little bit up. They will stay small. They will pay the small business tax regime, but you make it easier on them to cheat. And making it easier on them to cheat is not a bad thing, actually. The tax rate is the other consideration. You can't design the tax rate of the small business regime independently of the rest of the system. Now, a lot of the analyses that I showed here, or the results of analyses I showed here, are simplistic in some way because they think of taxes as a single tax on small business. But small business reacts to a number of other things in an economy. So small business may actually pay, let's say, withholding tax on wages of its employees. If you have employees, you have to pay withholding tax on wages. You may have to pay other fees, et cetera, et cetera. So they react to the combination of these and the impact of the combination of these things on their operations in such a way that it's extremely difficult for government actually to know how these interactions play out for the behavior of small business. So you want to keep things really as simple as possible for small business simply because they're a lot smarter than you are as a government. They know their situation a lot more than you do. And complicating things in the interest of being equitable to get really the right amount from the right individual or the right company simply does not work. So here's a bit of international experience. I played a little bit with plotting data using a database I had from a colleague of mine. So in the first panel, you have the turnover tax rate. So that's the turnover tax rate of a presumptive regime versus GDP per capita. And what this shows is perhaps you would think strangely, is that the richer the country is, the lower is the tax rate on small business. It's a bit awkward, right? Because you would think, high-income countries have better tax administration, they can afford higher rates on small business, but that's precisely the point. That's precisely the point. And this is actually what we would expect countries to do, is to have lower taxes if you can tax everybody. In developing countries, they have higher tax rates. Why? Because they can't tax all small business. They know they're constrained by the number. They can't control that number, so they increase the rate. So you end up by punishing a smaller share of the population. It's not the right thing to do. You actually have to you have to really go for a lower rate and just hope for the best, because you can't do otherwise. The tax administration can't do otherwise. This is a reality. If you could do otherwise, if information was perfect, then maybe you wouldn't want a small business regime. Maybe you just, a lot of countries don't have small business regime. And if you do have all these people in the regular regime, most of them wouldn't pay taxes anyway. They probably fall under the exempt threshold under the income tax. The other panel is how the threshold per capita, I scaled the per capita because it's easier to compare across countries. So the definition of a small business per capita divided by GDP, if you will, to the GDP per capita, so to the income level of a country. And again here, what's interesting is the richer the country, the higher the income, the lower is this threshold. So this is something that we would totally accept, because high-income countries tend to have more resources dedicated to tax administrations. They can afford to tax a higher number of their population. While in developing countries, they don't have the same resources. They put the threshold higher up. So in summary, I think, and I don't want to say, that's why I didn't call them recommendations, because I think for one to have real recommendation in a specific context, you need to learn a bit more about small business. And in the absence of knowing more about small business, neutrality and simplicity is really the best policy guide you can adopt. Not complexity and high rates. It's not wanting to be more controlling. It's actually the opposite. Simply because you don't know the structure of your small business population. So the first lesson is that informality is not a single, it's a multifaceted problem. We can't think of informality today as a small micro versus others. There are many, many ways of hiding income, and we have to think about policy design and administration according to these ways. We spoke about BEPS this morning. That's why I wanted to make the connection. BEPS is one way of dealing with one form of informality. But BEPS remain, to a large extent, dealing with the symptoms, not with the fundamental problem of why companies shift income. So those are fundamental problems that we can deal with imperfectly by having BEPS and other styles of anti-avoidance or anti-shifting practices. The other thing is, as I said, unlikely you can actually design a complex small business regime if the tax administration cannot follow it. And the worst one can do is to pretend that the tax administration can control any small business regime. So complicating tax administration rules because you cannot design policy right is actually the worst thing you can do. The literature has been confined to a large extent on rather simple cases. I think there's more work being done with more data being available on small business, but we have to keep in mind that life, even for small business, is actually a lot more complex. Just to give you an example, shifting in Egypt probably is the story of few thousand companies, let's say, right? These are the bulk of the companies, few thousand companies. Think about how many small business you have. It's a lot more complex, but the stakes are a lot lower. There's not enough income in those small business to care too much about this problem the way you care about profit shifting for large companies. The raison d'etre of a small business regime is not to tax small business. Let's say that you start today, you take away all the tax system that you have and you start from scratch. And you design a system for large business or medium business, and you forget about the small. You design the system not to tax the small. You design a system in order to prevent the medium and the large from classifying themselves as small. This is the single most important attribute of a well-designed system. It's not to tax the small, because there's no money in the small. It's to prevent the medium and the large from telling you, I am small, believe me, and you believe them. And last, I'd say this is, I put this, there were talks about this morning and a little bit here. I think it's a general rule, and we try to do a lot of work with countries in the region. METAC tries to do a lot of work in improving analytical capabilities. You want to deal with a problem, you don't design a policy for the problem. You first understand what the problem is. And this takes time sometimes, so we have to be honest enough with ourselves sometimes to say, let's study the problem correctly before we design policy. And if we can't design the perfect policy for it, that's fine. We'll design a second best policy or a third best policy. But we don't aim for, the best possible policy in the context of imperfect information and difficulties in doing analytical work to diagnose the problem. So let me stop here, and we'll continue the discussion later. Thank you very much.